The house was quiet, but the weight of betrayal was suffocating. Still, I gripped the deed in my hand, my fingers trembling ever so slightly. As my son's wife turned, her face drained of color, her eyes locked on the document, she knew what it meant. While she stumbled back, panic creeping into her voice, I finally realized the truth. They'd thought I'd never return, that they could claim everything I built. That's when I understood. I wasn't just back. I was here to take it all back, piece by piece. All right? Before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, sharp enough to pierce the fog of Lois Markham's mind. The soft hum of machines and the occasional rustle of linen was all she could hear as she slowly became aware of her surroundings. It had been 7 months. 7 months of darkness, of silence, of nothing but the shadowy embrace of a coma. But now, she was back. Her eyes flickered open, adjusting to the dim lighting of the rehab hospital room. The walls, pale and uninviting, seemed to close in on her, as if reminding her of the isolation she now found herself in. It wasn't the first time she'd woken from the haze, but this time it felt different. Clearer. More real. A nurse entered, her footsteps brisk and indifferent, her face hidden behind a mask that only accentuated the coldness in her eyes. She checked the IV drip, made a few notes on her clipboard, then turned to Lois. "Your family signed you over months ago," the nurse said without a hint of emotion. "You're legally incapacitated." The words barely registered at first. It was as if they hadn't been intended for her at all, just some cold fact delivered with the same distance she'd shown in her routine tasks. Lois's pulse quickened, her heart pounding in her chest like a distant drum. Her hands trembled, fingers curling into fists by her sides. She had never intended to be incapacitated. That wasn't part of the plan. And yet, it seemed that in her absence, a life she'd built, a life she'd trusted her family to uphold, had been quietly dismantled. Lois forced her voice to break through the fog. "I need my attorney," she said, her words hoarse but determined. "Get me my attorney." The nurse, without a word, exited the room, leaving Lois to sit in her growing panic. Alone again. Alone with nothing but the ticking of the clock and the sterile whiteness of the walls that seemed to close in even tighter. But then a different presence entered her space. Nina Reyes, Lois's oldest friend, her neighbor, and the only one who had dared to come near her during these long months. She appeared at the door like a shadow slipping between worlds. Nina's eyes scanned the room quickly, checking for any sign that Lois's presence was known. Her expression was a mixture of concern and a steely determination that Lois had come to recognize all too well. "They live in your house now," Nina said in a low, urgent voice, pulling up a chair to Lois's bedside. "And they're remodeling." Lois's chest tightened, a cold, bitter knot forming deep inside her. She struggled to sit up, the weight of the news hitting her like a punch to the gut. She hadn't been gone that long, had she? 7 months? 7 months wasn't long enough to erase everything, was it? Nina continued, her tone laced with a quiet fury. "Heather's got plans, Lois. She's already trying to turn your life into something else. Your house, your things, everything. And they're doing it while you can't even say a word." Lois clenched her jaw. How dare they? The rage that bubbled up inside her was a slow burn, simmering beneath the surface. But she kept it contained, her mind working furiously to process what Nina was saying. She could feel the weight of the question on the tip of her tongue, but it took all her energy to speak it aloud. "Where's Jordan?" Nina shook her head, her eyes hardening. "He's with her. Heather's pulling the strings. And Jordan, he's following her lead. He always does." Lois's mind was already whirring with the possibility of what to do next. The house. Her house. The one place she thought was untouchable. The one thing they couldn't take from her. And yet, There they were, living inside it, making changes as if it was theirs to mold. Her gaze flicked to the door, her thoughts sharp and clear now. "I need to see Maya," she said quietly. "I need her to come here. No one can know I'm back yet." Nina gave a brief, sharp nod, understanding the weight behind Lois's request. She'd kept Lois's secrets before. She'd protect her now. Lois closed her eyes briefly, taking a slow breath. She could feel the ache in her bones, the lingering effects of months in a coma. But there was something else, too. A spark. The fire that had never fully died, now reigniting with renewed purpose. Before Nina could leave, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. Pastor Ray. His face was the picture of solemnity, but his eyes, ever so kind, held something else. An unspoken promise of loyalty. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, holding something in his hand. "Lois," he said gently, his voice steady but with a weight of understanding behind it. "I have something for you." He placed a folder on the table next to her bed, and Lois's gaze snapped to it. Documents. She knew in an instant that this wasn't just any set of papers. This was something far more important. Something that would change everything. Nina's voice, low and grim, broke through the silence. "They never expected you to see these." Lois reached for the folder, her fingers trembling slightly as she flipped it open. As her eyes scanned the first page, the walls of her world cracked wide open, and in that moment, she understood. They thought a coma was an exit strategy, but Lois Markham wasn't done yet. Lois Markham had always been a woman who trusted her instincts, and as she drove the winding roads of Flagstaff, her hands gripped the wheel with a clarity she hadn't felt in months. The landscape around her, green pine trees, jagged mountain peaks, was familiar, comforting even. But now it felt different, like the world had shifted beneath her, and she was the only one who felt it. She wasn't going home. Not yet. Not until she was ready. The temporary rental car she'd secured was nondescript, blending in with the rest of the vehicles as she parked it in a quiet cul-de-sac on the outskirts of town. It was close enough to her real home to feel the proximity, but distant enough to allow her the illusion of privacy. She knew her family wouldn't suspect a thing. They thought she was still in the dark, still hidden away in some distant hospital room, forgotten by all but the few who had lied in wait for her return. Lois stared at the house she used to call her own from the safe distance of her rented space, a hollow ache spreading through her chest. It was a feeling of loss she hadn't expected. She had imagined anger, resentment, maybe even revenge. But this was different. It was a deep, profound grief that she couldn't shake. Her phone buzzed. It was Nina, sending her a series of photos. The first was a picture of her own home, its front lawn pristine, the house freshly painted. It looked nothing like the place Lois had left. It looked like a model home, one built for someone else entirely. The second picture was of the guest house, now listed on Airbnb, its windows wide open, the furniture inside new and modern. The description was slick, a glossy sales pitch, charming mountain retreat with stunning views, recently upgraded with luxurious finishes. Her stomach churned. Upgrades, her upgrades, paid for by her. Nina's message followed. Newly inherited estate with upgrades. They're even renting out the guest house now. This is all happening while you were gone, Lois. They thought you'd never wake up. Lois felt her pulse quicken, the tightness in her chest spreading to her throat. The image of Heather smiling behind a gleaming new kitchen counter, Jordan beside her, both of them pretending like they'd earned it, burned in her mind. But the real blow came when she opened the next photo. The mailbox. It was empty. Her name, once so prominent on the brass plate, was now replaced with a new label. Markham was nowhere to be found. "They've erased you," Nina had written. But not for long. Lois clenched her jaw, fighting the tremor in her hands as she dropped the phone onto the passenger seat. Her house, her legacy, erased in the blink of an eye, and for what? To build some sanitized, commercialized version of her life? To sell off pieces of her past, as if she had never mattered? She forced herself to breathe, steadying the thoughts racing through her mind. She would take it all back. Every piece. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She rose slowly, the weight of the situation settling like a stone in her gut. But there was no fear in her steps. She was prepared. Nina stood in the doorway, a heavy folder in hand. She didn't say anything immediately, but Lois could see the quiet fury in her eyes. Nina handed over the folder without ceremony. "Ray sent this," Nina said, her voice low and taut. "I confirmed it with the county. Your power of attorney? It was forged, Lois. Filed while you were on life support. They stole everything." Lois opened the folder, flipping through the pages with a methodical calm. The forged signature on the power of attorney was the first thing that caught her eye. And just beneath it, the official registration, the one that gave Heather the right to act on her behalf. She gripped the paper in her hand, letting the anger build like a storm inside her. "Lies," Lois whispered, almost to herself. "All lies." Nina crossed her arms, her expression hard. "They built everything on lies, Lois. They thought they could strip you of your dignity and your power while you were powerless. They thought you'd never come back." Lois's eyes narrowed, a quiet resolve settling in. "Then it won't stand." The words were soft but certain, like a vow. The house, the wealth, the life they were trying to claim as their own. It was all built on a foundation of deception. And Lois wasn't going to let it stand. A deep breath. Another, steadier. The next steps were already forming in her mind, calculations made with the precision of someone who had spent years working with details. There was no room for mistakes, no room for mercy. Maya would have to know. They couldn't waste any more time. Lois glanced at Nina. "Where's Maya?" Nina hesitated, then pulled out her phone. "I sent her a message. She'll be here soon." The thought of her granddaughter, sharp and calculating in her own right, was a comfort. Lois knew she wasn't the only one who understood how to fight this battle. Maya had always been loyal, and now, more than ever, she would be needed. Lois stood, the folder still in her hand, and walked toward the window. She stared out at the house, now a stranger to her. The place that had once held warmth, laughter, and memories of better days was now a hollow shell, filled with echoes of what it could have been. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Lois Markham had returned. And this time, she wasn't just coming back to take her life back. She was coming to burn everything they had built. A soft knock on the door. Maya was here. And Lois, for the first time in months, felt like she had a plan. Lois Markham didn't need to be there to feel the betrayal seeping from every corner of her home, but standing in the shadow of the construction site where her pool once had been, it became undeniable. The ground was torn up. Workers milling about with hammers and drills, cutting into her legacy with the same cold efficiency they'd used to dismantle her life. The new pool, once an extension of her pride, was now an extravagance that had no right to exist. The $62,000 in trust money that had been siphoned off in a series of fraudulent withdrawals had funded not just the pool, but the house's renovation, the upgrades she had never authorized. The vision she'd once had of quiet mornings by her pool, watching her garden bloom, had been replaced by these sterile, polished ideals of a life she never wanted. Lois stared at the sight, her anger simmering below the surface. But there was something else. Something more dangerous than her fury. It was the cold clarity of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. Her thoughts shifted, and she pulled her phone from her pocket. She thumbed through a few texts, one from Nina, confirming the transfer of the forged power of attorney documents, and another from Pastor Ray, outlining the next steps in making her estate's executor role official. She had one final piece to take care of: rewriting the estate. She needed to strip away the web of deceit that had been spun around her life and build something that could stand, something that no one could take away. Lois's fingers flew over the screen, rewriting the provisions in her will. 40% to Maya, her granddaughter, the one person who had never turned away, never faltered in her loyalty. 40% to an elder justice foundation, one that would help victims like herself, who had been taken advantage of by their own families. And 20% to the Veteran Housing Fund, an organization that helped displaced soldiers find a place to call home. Something she had seen too many times, a cause close to her heart. The ink on the page felt heavier now, charged with a sense of purpose that had been absent when she'd first written her will. It wasn't just a document anymore. It was a weapon, a declaration. And for the first time in months, Lois felt something akin to peace. Nina arrived just as Lois finished signing the last page. She stood in the doorway, a silent witness to the transformation happening before her eyes. "Ready?" Nina asked, her voice a low murmur, heavy with the weight of the task ahead. Lois looked up, a glimmer of resolve in her eyes. "More than ready." Pastor Ray was waiting for them outside. The car was parked by the curb, ready to go. Lois slid into the passenger seat, the final documents in her lap, her fingers brushing against the smooth leather binding of the deed. She knew what this meant. This was the last piece, the one that would secure her return. The house, the name, the legacy. Everything was about to change. Ray didn't say much on the drive, but his gaze in the rearview mirror was steady, unblinking. He had seen enough of the deceit, had heard the same stories Lois had, but unlike most, he hadn't looked away. He was the one who had fought to make sure her final wishes were respected, who had guided her through the legal maze, and who now stood beside her in her moment of reckoning. When they arrived at her house, the sight of the construction site, complete with workers still hammering away at the remnants of her dreams, was almost too much to bear. But Lois didn't flinch. She got out of the car, holding the deed tightly in her hands. Maya was already there, waiting at the front door. She was quiet, composed, but Lois could see the fire in her eyes. Her granddaughter understood more than anyone. She had watched this happen. She had been by her side during the long months of absence, and now she was here, ready to stand beside her in this final act of reclamation. "Maya," Lois said, her voice steady, though it trembled with the weight of what was about to happen. Maya walked up to her, holding out a leather-bound folder, the weight of it speaking volumes. "Here it is," she said softly, her eyes never leaving Lois's. "Your house, your name, your legacy." Lois's breath caught in her throat as she took the folder from her. She could feel the significance of it, the power it held. The battle was almost over. All that was left now was to make it real. "I came back to correct, not to fight," Lois whispered. Her words, quiet but certain, were more than just a statement. They were a declaration. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. It was about undoing the damage that had been done in her absence. Maya nodded. "You didn't just come back, Grandma. You came back to show them that no one gets to erase you." Lois opened the folder. The deed, freshly signed and stamped, sat in front of her. She could feel the finality of it, the weight of everything she had lost and everything she was about to reclaim. A rustling from behind her. Someone was approaching. Lois's eyes narrowed as she saw Jordan walking up the path, his hands in his pockets, his expression a mixture of surprise and something she couldn't quite place. He stopped at the foot of the steps, his gaze flicking from Lois to Maya, to the documents in Lois's hands. For a moment, the air between them crackled with unspoken tension. "You thought I was gone?" Lois said quietly, lifting the deed just enough for him to see. "But I'm not. And neither is my name." Jordan's eyes flickered with something. Guilt? Regret? It didn't matter now. Lois Markham wasn't here to play games anymore. The world was about to change. And this time, it would stand. The morning was crisp. The kind of morning that made Lois feel more alive with each passing breath. The air outside her home smelled faintly of pine and fresh earth, the remnants of a world untouched by the lies her family had spun around her. But it was different now. Her world was coming back into focus, one piece at a time. Inside, she moved with purpose, the weight of the deed still resting in her hands, a reminder of everything she had reclaimed. Maya was at the kitchen counter, a series of documents spread out before her. She'd been working tirelessly to ensure everything was in order, but today was different. Today, the final hammer would fall. Lois took the last step in a long journey when she picked up the phone and called the county recorder's office. Her voice was steady, almost calm, as she made the request. "I need you to file an emergency affidavit. My doctor will confirm that I am cognitively sound. I am medically stable. The power of attorney needs to be revoked immediately." The voice on the other end hesitated for a moment, but Lois had already prepared for that. The confirmation came just as quickly as the paperwork was finalized. There were no questions left to ask. It was done. She hung up the phone, the satisfaction that came with the task feeling almost too easy. They had tried to erase her, to write her out of the story, but Lois was rewriting the ending. "Done," Lois said softly as she glanced at Maya. Her granddaughter didn't look up immediately, but Lois saw the small, approving nod. They both knew what came next. By afternoon, the deed had been filed, and the house was officially re-registered in trust. The keys to her future, to her life, were back in her hands, legally unchallengeable, and that wasn't all. Maya moved to the security system, the device beeping as she input the new codes. The system had been silently monitoring their every move since Lois returned, but now it was time to make it official. Locks were changed, the old codes erased. The house was sealed. The sense of finality hung heavy in the air, a quiet tension that wrapped around the house like a cloak. Lois stood still for a moment, taking in the walls of the home that had been hers for so long. The betrayal had stained it, but now she would cleanse it. No more lies, no more games. This was her domain. The quiet was broken by a car pulling up outside. Lois didn't need to look out the window. She knew who it was. The door slammed shut as Jordan made his entrance. He hadn't even knocked, the way he had always done when he had felt entitled to just walk in. The moment the door opened, the tension in the air thickened. Jordan stood in the doorway, his eyes flicking across the room before settling on the thick red tag that now hung prominently on the front door. A legal notice, unmistakable in its clarity. "Do not enter," he read aloud, his voice laced with disbelief. His hand hovered over the doorframe as if waiting for it to suddenly vanish, to pull him into the house he'd once believed was his for the taking. The words were simple, but the weight they carried was clear. His time in this house was over. Lois stepped forward, her gaze locking onto his with a quiet, deliberate strength. There was no anger in her eyes, just the firm, unwavering certainty of a woman who had reclaimed what was hers. Maya, standing slightly behind her, glanced up at Lois, her voice calm but cutting, like the edge of a well-sharpened blade. "You own everything again, and they know it." Jordan's eyes narrowed, his face flushing with a mix of frustration and confusion. He opened his mouth to say something, but Lois raised a hand, stopping him before the words could escape. "Don't. It's over." The finality in her voice hung in the air like a sentence. There was no going back now, no room for negotiation. The home that had been taken from her, the life that had been stolen, was now hers again. Maya, quiet as ever, handed Lois a single envelope, the contents folded neatly within. Lois knew what it was before she opened it. A copy of the newly registered trust documents, now secured and stamped. Everything in its place, everything set in motion. Jordan stood frozen at the door, his mouth working to form words, but they came out jagged and wrong. The realization was setting in. He had lost. And Lois hadn't just returned to take what was hers, she had come back to take control. Without another word, Lois turned toward the kitchen, moving through the house like she owned every inch of it. And she did. She felt the weight of it settle around her like a cloak, and the tight knot in her chest began to loosen. Just a little. Behind her, Maya gave Jordan a long, assessing glance before following Lois into the next room. The sound of the door slamming shut behind them was like the final note of a symphony, both triumphant and somber. Lois had returned to reclaim not just the house, but her identity, her dignity, and the life she had fought so long to protect. And Jordan? He was left standing at the threshold, staring at the red tag on the door, his link to the past severed. In the silence that followed, Lois felt a quiet peace settle in, one that no one could take from her. It was her world again, her rules. The game had changed, and this time, she was in control. Lois sat at the kitchen table, a stack of papers before her, each one a piece of the betrayal that had been carefully crafted while she lay in a coma. The house, her home, felt cold again, despite the warmth she had brought back with her presence. There was a sense of finality in the air now, a weight that had been slowly building, piece by piece, over the last few days. The ledger she had started compiling was almost complete. Every charge, every transfer, every misuse of trust. Her hand moved steadily, flipping through receipts and bank statements, organizing the facts into neat piles. Her eyes scanned the lines with precision, tracing each dollar spent, each item purchased, and every withdrawal made from the trust fund that had once been her lifeblood. There was no room for mistakes now. She was done playing the victim. The charges against Heather were clear. A luxury spa day here. A $5,000 renovation there. Business expenses for Heather's wellness company. Expenses that Lois hadn't approved, and certainly hadn't authorized. Lois had known something was off when she'd seen the sleek new yoga studio, the clean lines of the furniture, the spa treatments plastered all over Heather's social media. But now, it was all laid bare in front of her. Each purchase, each transfer, was written down in stark black and white. The stolen funds were unmistakable. Lois took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing as she pulled out the final page, a wire transfer for $62,000. It was the amount that had funded the pool and renovations at the house, the sum that Heather had spent as if it were her own, all in the name of comfort and luxury, while Lois lay unconscious in a hospital bed. It was the tipping point, the moment when Lois knew that this would not go unanswered. She glanced up at Maya, who stood in the doorway, watching her with a quiet intensity. Maya had always been sharp, but today she seemed even more focused, more purposeful. She had helped Lois gather the evidence, had listened as the numbers began to tell their story. They both knew what was coming next. "I've compiled everything," Lois said, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of what it all meant. "Every charge, every withdrawal. There's no way they can hide now." Maya nodded, stepping forward to hand her the phone. Pastor Ray's name flashed across the screen. Lois answered, her fingers tapping the edge of the table with a steady rhythm. "Pastor Ray," she said, her voice firm. "It's done. I've sent the final documents. Forward them to the Elder Fraud Task Force. This ends now." Pastor Ray's voice came through the speaker with the same calm authority Lois had come to rely on. It will be handled. We're on it. You'll hear from them soon. Lois disconnected the call and placed the phone down, her eyes still focused on the ledger. Each number was a nail in the coffin of Heather's carefully constructed web. But it wasn't just about the money, it was about the trust that had been broken, the years of manipulation that had taken root in Lois's own family. This was bigger than a few stolen dollars. It was about justice, about restoring what had been taken from her, piece by piece. Maya spoke softly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "Jordan's trying to arrange a family meeting," she said, her voice calm but tinged with something harder beneath. "He wants to talk about moving forward." Lois's lips curled into a small, bitter smile. "He's late," she said simply. "Tell him no." Maya didn't hesitate. She nodded and turned to send the message. Lois wasn't interested in negotiating. Not anymore. There was no space left for apologies, no room left for explanations. They had taken what was hers, and now it was time for them to face the consequences. Lois had no more words for them. Nina arrived shortly afterward, a quiet storm in her own right. She was always ready for the fight, always prepared for the worst. But today, there was something different in her eyes, something that matched Lois's own sense of finality. She stood across from Lois, her arms crossed, taking in the scene. "That wasn't just theft, Lois," Nina said, her voice low and firm. "That was arrogance. They thought you wouldn't notice, thought you wouldn't come back." Lois looked up at her friend, her gaze unwavering. "They thought wrong." A quiet knock at the door interrupted the moment. Lois didn't move. Maya opened the door and Jordan stood there, his face twisted in confusion. He had come to fight, to reason, to smooth things over. But there was no room for that here. Lois looked him over once, then twice, before her gaze returned to the ledger. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of a confrontation. He would get nothing from her now. "Tell him to leave," Lois said, her voice soft but final. Maya didn't say a word, just turned and closed the door. The soft click of the lock echoed in the silence, and Lois let out a slow, steady breath. She was done. She had her power back. It was over. The house, the legacy, her life. Everything was in her hands now. They had thought they could steal from her. They had thought they could erase her. But Lois Markham wasn't so easily discarded. She was the one with the last word. And this time, she was writing her own ending. As she looked over the evidence one more time, the thought came to her like a whisper in the dark. Let them try to take it from me now. The diagnosis came like an unwelcome guest, a shadow that fell across Lois Markham's life when she least expected it. Congestive heart failure. Stage 3. The words had the weight of a sentence, but Lois hadn't flinched. She had learned long ago not to cower at life's blows, and this one was no different. Sitting in the sterile, clinical room of her doctor's office, Lois felt the familiar tightness in her chest. But this time, it wasn't just from the cold. It was the weight of her heart, failing, but not broken. Not yet. She didn't tell anyone, not right away. They didn't deserve to know. Her family had abandoned her long ago, left her to wither in a coma, to be exploited without a second thought. They hadn't come when she was at her lowest. They wouldn't come now. Instead, Lois took control of what she could. She moved into a small care suite in a nearby facility. Not one of those institutions that sucked the dignity from the elderly, but a place she could afford, a place she could run with her own money, on her own terms. She didn't need anyone's charity. Not Jordan's. Not Heather's. The room was small but peaceful, its simple furnishings offering comfort where her family had offered betrayal. Lois sank into the recliner by the window, gazing out at the autumn trees swaying in the cool breeze. The world outside seemed so far away, and for a moment, She allowed herself to forget everything until the doorbell rang. It was a delivery. Orchids. The delicate lavender petals seemed at odds with the coldness of the gesture. A note, simple, unsigned, dangled from the small stem. Lois didn't need to read it to know who they were from. Heather. Lois placed the orchids on the small wooden table beside her bed. They were beautiful, but they held no meaning. No note. No apology. No recognition of the fact that her life had been torn apart by the very hands that had sent these flowers. Maya stood in the doorway, her gaze sharp as she observed the arrangement. "She's trying to act like everything's fine," Maya said quietly, stepping further into the room, like she's the one who did something right. Lois's lips tightened into a thin line. She didn't look at the flowers, didn't need to. Her gaze stayed fixed on the horizon outside the window. "That's what they always do, Maya. They act like they did nothing wrong, but it's too late for them." Maya moved closer, her voice soft but sure. "They won't come, Grandma. Not now. Not ever." Lois turned her head slowly, locking eyes with her granddaughter. She didn't need to ask what Maya meant. The emptiness in the house, the silence from her son, the hollow gestures, it all spoke volumes. Jordan hadn't visited since she returned. Not once. His wife's empty gestures, her orchids, were nothing more than a reminder of the chasm between them. "That's what the will is for," Lois replied, her voice quiet but steady. "Let them think they can pretend. Let them think they can erase what they did to me. My will be the final word." Her eyes moved to the desk where a stack of papers waited, a folder thick with the weight of the decisions she had made. She had been clear about her intentions. She'd given Maya what she deserved, what she had earned. The rest was for causes Lois believed in. No one else. Not Jordan. Not Heather. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Pastor Ray, as calm and steady as always. He stepped inside, a folder in his hand, the weight of it speaking volumes. "Lois, it's time," he said gently. She nodded and motioned to the chair beside her. Pastor Ray had been more than a guide. He had become the executor of her estate, the keeper of her final wishes. She trusted him. It was enough. He opened the folder and slid out the papers, updating her advance directive to reflect her wishes. Every word was carefully chosen. She'd done this herself, with her own hands. No family member would get to claim any say in her final moments, not when they hadn't earned it. Her voice had already been stolen. The only thing left was to make sure it was heard when the time came. "Maya, come here," Lois called, her voice quieter now. Her granddaughter moved toward her, and Lois handed her the updated documents. "Sign these. It's the last thing we do." Maya took the pen, her hand steady as she added her signature to the line beneath Lois's. It was symbolic, of course, but it was also the final piece, the one that would ensure her voice was never silenced again. Once it was done, Lois reached for the small camera on the side table. There were 5 videos to record. Her final words, her final testimony, each one a declaration of ownership, of life, of truth. The first video began as Lois's face appeared on the screen. Her features, a little thinner now, still held the sharpness of determination. "If you're watching this, I'm gone. But know this. Ownership isn't inheritance. The things I've built, the life I've created, none of it belongs to anyone who doesn't deserve it. Not Jordan. Not Heather. Not anyone who thinks they can take what they didn't earn." Her eyes, once full of warmth and love, were cold with the resolve that only came from a woman who had lived through too much and had come out stronger. "I am more than what they think they can take from me. I am what I leave behind. I am the choices I've made. And I will not let them rewrite my story." As the video ended, Lois sat back in her chair, the weight of everything she had left to say finally lifting. There was peace in this final act of defiance, peace in knowing she was finally taking control. Maya stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. Lois knew that Maya would carry her legacy, not in money or possessions, but in the lesson of strength. "I'll finish the rest," Lois said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Maya nodded, the weight of her grandmother's wishes resting on her shoulders. The final words were in place. All Lois had left to do was wait. But as the silence filled the room, Lois felt no fear, no regret. She had done everything she needed to. Her story, her life, her final word was no longer theirs to control. It was hers, and she would have the last say. The cream-colored envelope sat on the kitchen table, thick and weighty, almost out of place in the dim light of the room. Lois had been expecting it. She had known, in some quiet part of her, that Jordan would come. He had no choice. It was in his blood to try to make things right, even when he had never truly earned the right to. Maya was the one who found it first. She entered the room quietly, holding the envelope as though it might shatter in her hands. Her gaze flicked up to Lois, searching her face for a sign of emotion, but there was none. Lois's face remained still, a mask of calm composure. "Maya," Lois said softly, her voice like a blade in the silence. "Open it." Maya didn't hesitate. She tore open the envelope, pulling out a thick ledger bound with a simple black ribbon. The paper inside was heavy, the words precise. It was Jordan's attempt at redemption, or at least, an attempt to cover his tracks. It was a list, a detailed record of every dollar, every date, every charge that had been made with Lois's money. She had never asked for the specifics. She had never needed them. But Jordan thought this would be enough. He thought this would show her that he understood the weight of what he had done. Maya flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the entries. There were dates of payments, large sums, small sums, and everything was accounted for in meticulous detail. For a moment, she almost thought this was some form of apology, some acknowledgement of wrong. But then she came to the last page where Lois's handwriting was unmistakable, scrawled in the margin with sharp, deliberate strokes. Your debt was emotional. Your repayment was silence. Lois didn't need to read it. She had already known the words would be there. Silence. It was the only currency that could be paid back after everything they had done to her. There was nothing else left to give. Maya closed the ledger slowly, the weight of the pages sinking into her bones. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The ledger was nothing more than a poor attempt at redemption, a feeble offering that meant nothing now. "What are you going to do with it?" Maya asked quietly, her voice thick with something Lois couldn't quite place. Maybe it was anger, maybe it was regret, but Lois knew that nothing would make the hurt go away. Lois stood and walked over to the desk, pushing the ledger aside. "It goes into the pile, like everything else. Just another reminder." She didn't say anything else about Jordan. She didn't need to. He had given her everything she needed, and now it was all in place. That evening, the stillness of the house pressed in like a weight. The sky outside was an endless canvas of dark blue and violet, the trees swaying in the gentle breeze. Lois sat by the window again, her thoughts drifting like the clouds outside. She was alone. There was no knocking at the door. No phone calls from Jordan or Heather. No apologies. Her funeral arrangements were the last task she needed to finalize. She had already made the decisions months ago, signed the forms, and given the instructions to Pastor Ray. But there was something final about it. Something irrevocable. The instructions were simple, practical, and exactly what Lois wanted. No eulogies, no speeches about who she had been or what she had done. There would be music. Yes, but only the music that reminded her of who she had been, not who they thought she was. She wanted no performance, no pretense. She had lived her life with sincerity, and that was the only thing she wanted to leave behind. The doorbell rang again, pulling Lois from her thoughts. This time, it wasn't a delivery. It was Nina. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her sharp eyes scanning the room, taking in the quiet tension in the air. "They're still not here, are they?" Nina asked, a low murmur of disbelief in her voice. Lois gave a small shake of her head. "They'll never come, Nina. Not truly. Not when it matters." Nina's face softened for a moment, the fierce fire that usually burned behind her eyes dimming just a little. "They'll regret it. All of them." Lois didn't reply. She didn't need to. The silence in the room was all the answers she needed. Nina reached into her bag and pulled out a small box, placing it gently in front of Lois. "This is from Ray," she said quietly. "He thought you might want to see it." Lois looked at the box, her curiosity piqued. She opened it slowly, and inside was a small silver pendant, a delicate tree, with roots that seemed to reach deep into the earth. It wasn't extravagant, but the weight of it in her hand told Lois everything she needed to know. Ray had understood. This was a symbol of something deeper. It wasn't just the legacy of her wealth, or her property, or her belongings. It was the legacy of her spirit, the life she had built. Lois held the pendant in her palm for a moment, and then, without a word, she placed it around her neck. The small weight against her chest felt like a reminder of what she had fought for: herself. A sudden thought struck Lois, and her lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. She could almost hear Heather's voice in her mind, the way she would spin her words to make herself the victim, to shift the blame. But Lois wasn't about to let anyone else control her story. "They'll understand when it's too late," Lois said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Nina didn't need to ask who they were. She already knew. The house was quiet again, but now, Lois felt a small sense of peace settle over her. She had everything in place. Everything was ready. And when the time came, Lois Markham would be remembered, not for the things they had taken, but for the strength she had shown. It was time for them to see it, to face it. And Lois would be waiting, silent and strong. It came in the form of a letter, though Lois had already heard it in her mind 1,000 times before. Heather's handwriting was unmistakable, though there was a certain flatness to it now. The kind of forced apology that had no weight, no real sincerity. It was the same letter Heather had written 1,000 times in her head, the one that couldn't repair the damage she had done, the one that couldn't unmake the choices she had made. But the letter would never arrive. At least, not in Lois's hands. Ray had intercepted it at her request. He didn't need to tell her what it said. She knew. He had known too. Lois had anticipated this. The letter was just another attempt. Another desperate plea from someone who didn't understand that you couldn't buy forgiveness with words, or with the empty gestures they had offered her over the years. Lois didn't read it. She didn't need to. There was nothing in it that could change what had happened, nothing in it that could undo the years of lies and manipulation. Her phone buzzed, another interruption. This time it was an email from Jordan. It was a short message, and yet it hung in the air with the weight of an entire lifetime of guilt. "Tell her we miss her." Maya didn't respond, not immediately. Lois could see her staring at the screen, her face unreadable. After a long pause, Maya set the phone down and looked at Lois. "They're trying, but it's too little. Too late, isn't it?" Maya asked, her voice thick with something more than just anger now. It was understanding. The realization that words, no matter how much they tried to make them sound like remorse, weren't enough. Lois met her gaze and nodded. "They miss what I gave them. Not me. The money. The power. the status. Her voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable bitterness in it. But the real price? They'll never understand it. Maya picked up the pen and added another line to the will that Lois had been perfecting for months. Neither Jordan nor Heather may use my name or likeness in any future promotions, brands, or family legacy projects. The final clause was simple, but it sealed everything. No more taking credit for her life, no more profiting from her story. They couldn't spin this one, couldn't turn it into a symbol of their false remorse. Lois would make sure of that. And then came the final act of defiance, the final step in her process of subtraction. Nina arrived with a single rose in hand, its petals a stark contrast to the dark evening outside. She placed it carefully on the table in front of Lois, a bottle of Malbec beside it. "For your final move," Nina said, her voice softer than usual, but still filled with that same quiet intensity. "You're doing it, Lois. You're finally cutting the strings." Lois reached out and took the bottle, her fingers grazing the cool glass. She didn't need to ask Nina what this moment meant. They both understood. The rose, the wine. It was the last act of letting go. The final gesture in her life's story. A quiet celebration of subtraction. To subtraction, Lois whispered to herself, pouring the wine slowly into her glass. It took everything before it gave me anything. Nina didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. Lois's words were enough. They were the culmination of everything she had been through, the years of silence, of watching her family fracture, of understanding that love and forgiveness meant nothing when they were twisted by greed. In the end, it wasn't the things that mattered. It was the things that had been taken. She had lost so much, but she had gained something far more valuable, her own strength, her own peace. Later that evening, as the last of the guests filed out, Lois remained seated at the table, the glass of wine resting in front of her, untouched. The nonprofit dinner had been held in her honor, a final tribute to the work she had done, the life she had lived. But Lois had refused to speak. She had no words left to offer them. The donations, the legacy, they would speak for themselves. Lois had given everything she needed to. There was no need for applause, no need for recognition. The truth had already been laid bare. Her gaze lingered on the wine, the rose, on the things she had already let go of. Lois Markham had done what she needed to do. The world would remember her not for the things they had taken, but for the strength with which she had let it all go. The true legacy she would leave wasn't built on money or status or power. It was built on resilience, on the quiet strength to walk away from those who had tried to steal her dignity. And when they tried to rewrite the story of her life, they would find nothing left to take. Nothing left but silence. Lois Markham died quietly, as she had lived, on her own terms. The room was dim, the only light coming from the soft glow of a lamp by the bedside. Outside, the world continued on, unaware of the quiet power that had left it. There were no machines, no beeping monitors to mark her passing. No tubes, no intrusive efforts to keep her tethered to a world she had long since distanced herself from. Only the soft music she had chosen, simple, gentle, the kind that matched the way she had wanted to go. She wasn't afraid. When the end came, it was peaceful, the kind of exit that most people never get. No fanfare, no final gasp for breath. Just a quiet surrender to the natural rhythm of life. Maya was there, her eyes never leaving Lois's still form. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but she didn't cry. She had been preparing for this, in a way, for years. She stayed with her grandmother's body for 2 full hours before telling anyone. The silence in the room felt sacred, like a final moment of connection that needed no words. When the phone call came, it was Ray, Pastor Ray, on the other end. His voice was steady, but there was a quiet sadness to it, an understanding that Lois's absence was the end of something and the beginning of another kind of reckoning. "I'll take care of the rest," Ray said. He had always been the one to protect her, to guide her through the decisions that no one else wanted to make. Lois had trusted him with everything, and now he would make sure that her final wishes were carried out without interruption. And he did. Ray didn't make a spectacle of Lois's death. There would be no public mourning, no funeral procession for the family to gather around, pretending like they hadn't turned their backs on her. Lois had made it clear in the will: no funeral invitation, no obituary. No flowers. It was a statement. Lois wasn't going to let anyone hijack her death the way they had hijacked her life. Instead, Ray opened the church vault, retrieving the final version of the will that Lois had signed just days before her passing. Everything was in order, perfectly clear. No room for dispute. Lois had made sure that Jordan and Heather would get nothing more than they deserved, and everything she had built would go to those who had supported her and believed in her until the very end. The sealed envelope was delivered not by phone, not by some friendly handoff, but by a courier. They didn't deserve to be told in any personal way. Their first notification was official, cold. A statement in itself. The Markham family was no longer welcome in the legacy of Lois Markham. Jordan received his envelope first, the seal cracking open in his hand with a sense of finality. He had known, on some level, that Lois wouldn't let him off the hook. But seeing it in black and white, the words, her handwriting, the truth laid out before him, hit him in a way that no verbal apology ever could. Heather received her own envelope shortly after, her fingers trembling as she tore it open. She had spent years weaving a story of entitlement, of manipulation, of pretending to be the grieving, faithful daughter-in-law. But now, it was over. Lois had taken her last step, and there was no way for Heather to rewrite this one. As the world continued to move forward, Lois's death was nothing but a quiet punctuation mark, unnoticed by those who hadn't truly seen her in life. They thought they would come together in grief. They thought they would be able to reclaim some part of her, some sliver of the empire she had built. But there would be no eulogies, no hollow tributes. The only voice that would speak on her behalf was Clara. The woman who had quietly witnessed Lois's life, who had watched from the outside as her family tore itself apart, would be the one to stand at the front. And in that moment, the only words Lois would allow to echo were simple, stark, and true. Generosity without gratitude is theft. There was no tearful recollection of happy memories. There was no attempt to paint Lois as a saint or a martyr. There was just the truth of her life, the truth that could never be taken back. Maya stood at the back of the room, her hands folded in front of her, watching the words unfold. The only people left to mourn Lois were the ones who truly knew her, the ones who had fought beside her, not for what they could gain, but for what they believed in. The rest? They would have their moment of reckoning later. But for now, Lois had spoken her last words. And now, it was time for them to see just how little they had left to take. The day Lois Markham was laid to rest was quiet, almost too quiet. There were no speeches, no mourners filling the pews with empty words. Only the handful of people who had truly mattered in her life, those who had stood by her when it mattered, those who had given without expectation. The family, on the other hand, was conspicuously absent. There would be no hollow tributes from Jordan or Heather. Lois had made sure of that. Her will was a quiet strike, a final breath of power in a world that had spent too long trying to take what wasn't theirs. Ethan and Heather were gone, erased completely. Their names would never appear in any of the documents that followed. No inheritance, no mention, nothing. Lois had made sure the no contest clause would trigger, locking her will from any challenge. The last of their hopes vanished when they saw the envelope. Cold, final, and unyielding. Maya watched from the back of the room as the contents of the estate were divided with precision: 40% to the nonprofit for elder justice, 40% to the Veterans Housing Fund, and the remaining 20% to Maya herself. Lois's legacy was never about money, but about the things that truly mattered. As the will was read, the truth of it sank in like a stone. No bloodline, no ties of family would ever take precedence over behavior, over loyalty. The Markham name would carry on, but not through them, through Maya, through the quiet strength she had inherited. Later, Heather was found behind closed doors, sobbing uncontrollably. She had never expected this. She had always believed that the house, the wealth, everything, was hers for the taking. She had spent years building her image of Lois as a fool, a victim. And now, that image had shattered into 1,000 pieces. She weaponized death, Heather sobbed, though her words rang hollow, even to her own ears. She didn't understand. She never had. Meanwhile, the funeral had wrapped up, but the whispers of those who had attended floated in the air like smoke. A cousin, his voice low and respectful, leaned over to another. "She warned you in how little she said." The words stung with truth. Lois had always been the quiet one, the one who observed, who calculated, who kept her cards close. In her silence, she had left them with everything they needed to know, if they had only listened. Maya, standing outside in the cool air, clutched a sealed note in her hand. It had been left for her by Pastor Ray, the final piece to complete Lois's message. She opened it carefully, her fingers trembling slightly as she read. "Legacy is not blood, it's behavior." The weight of those words settled into her chest. Lois had given Maya everything she needed: the trust, the strength, and the knowledge that the true measure of a person was how they lived, not what they were born into. Blood may have connected them, but it was actions that would carry the name Markham forward. Later, Pastor Ray posted a message on the nonprofit's website, one that would be seen by many, but understood by only a few. In memory of a donor whose family failed her, and a granddaughter who never did. The words, simple and direct, were a tribute to Lois's life, but also to the lessons she had taught. The legacy Lois left behind was one of strength, resilience, and the ability to walk away when the world became too small for what mattered. Maya stood silently, watching the world that Lois had left behind begin to unfold. The door had closed on one chapter, but this was just the beginning. The Markham name would be carried on, but it wouldn't be built on lies. It would be built on truth. And Maya? She would make sure that truth never faded. The finality of it all hung in the air like a low hum, a quiet victory that spoke louder than any eulogy could. Lois had done more than just protect what was hers. She had set the stage for something much larger, something that no one could ever take away. It didn't take long for Heather to post her tribute. The words were carefully chosen, dripping with the kind of sorrow that seemed manufactured, too clean, too rehearsed. She shared a photo of Lois, the smile so carefully curated, the one that fit the image Heather wanted the world to see. The grieving daughter-in-law, the devoted family member. The daughter who had taken on the weight of caring for her mother-in-law. It was perfect. Too perfect. A polished, emotionless attempt to reclaim a narrative she had never truly earned. But it didn't last. The post was flagged less than an hour later, and within the hour, it was gone. Flagged for defamation. No one could claim to have loved Lois Markham when they had taken so much from her. No amount of carefully chosen words could undo the betrayal. Heather stared at the notification on her screen in disbelief. Her fingers trembled as she tapped at the keys, trying to fight back against the system, against the truth that had been laid bare in Lois's will. But there was no fight left in her. The damage was already done. Maya, on the other hand, didn't need to fight. She had nothing to prove, nothing to gain by trying to rewrite the past. She had lived it. She had witnessed it. And she knew that sometimes silence was louder than anything else. Maya's response was quiet, unassuming. A photo. A single moment. It was of Lois sitting at the easel, lost in the rhythm of her painting. The light from the window kissed Lois's face softly, and there was no artifice in the image, no forced posturing. Just a woman in her element. The caption was simple. She never needed applause, just space. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a cry for sympathy. It was a statement, as clear and true as the image itself. The kind of quiet defiance that had defined Lois's life. The post began to spread, first quietly, then with a force that was almost overwhelming. In hours, it was reshared over 80,000 times. Comments flooded in, some of them from people who had never known Lois, but who recognized her in the image, who recognized that kind of peace. The nonprofit featured it in their annual report, a reminder of the woman who had been more than just a benefactor. She had been a force of quiet strength, a reminder of what truly mattered. Meanwhile, Heather's social media account began to spiral. Her posts, once so polished and self-assured, now came across as desperate. The tribute was just the first of many attempts to reclaim the narrative. But the comment sections turned cold. Her followers, the ones who had once admired her polished facade, now saw her for what she truly was. "Does anyone else feel uncomfortable about this?" One comment read, "This seems less like mourning and more like marketing. Not sure how you can claim to care about someone when you take everything from them," another added. Heather tried to explain herself in the comments, but the damage had been done. The internet was unforgiving. The silence that followed felt heavier than any words she could muster. As the days wore on, Ethan tried again. A new post. A statement about Lois's life, about the legacy she had left behind. He tried to mask his intentions behind phrases like respect, legacy, and honoring her memory. But even his words couldn't shield him from the reality that everyone could see now. Lois had already spoken. A legal warning came the next day from Ray's office. No further posts. No more claims. Lois's estate had already made its final statement. Anything they tried to claim, any attempt to rewrite history, would be met with legal consequences. Ethan didn't even bother to respond. Instead, he deleted his accounts, his presence on the digital world fading away, like smoke on the wind. It wasn't just about his online persona. It was about erasing the last vestiges of the lie. Lois had severed him from the legacy he had tried to claim, and now, in the quiet aftermath, he was gone. The silence this time was permanent. Maya sat back in her chair, looking at the comments on her post. There were still some trolls, some who tried to stir the pot with baseless accusations. But the flood of support far outweighed the negativity. The internet had moved on, and so had she. She had nothing left to prove to anyone. Her grandmother had left her everything she needed. A quiet, powerful example of resilience. A legacy not built on appearances, but on integrity. The silence in the room, the stillness that had followed Lois's death, now felt like a kind of peace. The finality of it all, the quiet victories won through absence rather than presence, spoke louder than any apology could. Lois Markham had left a mark on the world, not through the things she owned, but through the way she lived. And now, in the silence of the room, it was clear that her story, her truth, would be the one that carried forward. Maya's phone buzzed just as she was sitting down at her grandmother's old desk, the papers from Lois's estate spread out in front of her. She had grown accustomed to the silence, to the absence that hung in the air since Lois passed. But now, this. This felt like a reminder of something she didn't need to be reminded of. It was a message from her lawyer. Heather had sent a check. No note, no words of apology. Just a check. Her heart sank. She hadn't expected anything. But then again, she hadn't expected this. This final, hollow gesture. Maya stared at the notification for a long time, the weight of it pressing down on her chest. It wasn't money she wanted. It wasn't restitution that could ever heal what had been broken. It was just money. Cold. Impersonal. She sat in silence for a moment longer before standing and walking to the desk where she'd kept Lois's will. She pulled open the drawer, retrieved the copy of the will, and held the check in her hand. There was no need for words. She didn't need to explain why she did it. She didn't need to justify the act. With one clean, deliberate motion, she tore the check in half. The sound was sharp, like the final snap of a brittle thread that had already unraveled. Maya grabbed the tape from the desk and carefully taped the halves back together, right on top of the copy of Lois's will. The check had meant nothing, just as Heather's hollow apology had meant nothing. But this act, this gesture, felt right. It was a reminder. The truth had already been written, and there was nothing that could alter it now. The check, taped to the will, was her way of sealing the final chapter. No restitution, no forgiveness bought with money. Heather couldn't undo what she'd done. The betrayal was far beyond the worth of any check. The doorbell rang. Maya didn't flinch. She had known this moment would come, just as she had known the check would. She stood up from the desk, walked across the room, and opened the door to find Ray standing there, as composed as ever. He held a phone to his ear, speaking softly to someone on the other end. "I'll call you back," Ray said, hanging up the phone with a quiet finality. "She wanted you to know," he said to Maya, his voice steady but tinged with an understanding she couldn't quite place. "She didn't die hurt. She died clear." Maya didn't say anything for a moment. It wasn't the first time Ray had spoken about Lois's clarity in death, but somehow it still landed with the force of a revelation. She had lived her life on her terms, in control even at the very end. And now she had passed with that same strength. No regrets. No unfinished business. She knew exactly what she was doing, Ray continued, stepping inside, his eyes glancing at the taped check on the desk. Lois always made her decisions with purpose. Maya nodded, but she didn't answer right away. She needed a moment, just a moment to let the weight of Lois's life settle in. A life that had been lived with intention, even in the face of those who sought to take everything. Later that evening, Maya stood by the window, the cool air brushing across her face, her eyes unfocused as she gazed at the darkening sky. She felt something stir within her, a purpose, one she hadn't expected. Lois had left her far more than money. She had left her a mission. "I want to donate half of my inheritance," Maya said, her voice cutting through the quiet room, steady and determined. "I want to donate it to a legal clinic, one that handles elder exploitation cases. There are people who need the help Lois never got." Ray, standing beside her, looked over at Maya. "That's a worthy cause," he said quietly. Maya gave a small, satisfied smile. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about making sure that what Lois had fought for lived on in a way that mattered. The money would be used to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, just as Lois had never been protected. Nina arrived later that evening, bringing a quiet, intimate gathering with her. There were no grand celebrations, no big speeches. Just wine, olives, and the smell of rosemary from the small dinner she'd prepared. It was perfect in its simplicity, a small meal shared between those who truly understood Lois's life and legacy. As they sat together, the conversation was easy, flowing from one topic to the next. But for Maya, there was something bigger at play. She understood now what Lois had meant all those years. It wasn't about the money. It was about what she had left behind, what she had built through integrity, through the quiet moments, the choices made in solitude. Nina, noticing the contemplative look on Maya's face, raised her glass. "To Lois," she said, her voice steady, honoring the woman they all knew and loved. Maya lifted her glass too, the soft clink of it against the others a simple affirmation of what was true. "She didn't leave me money," Maya said quietly, her voice firm but filled with gratitude. "She left me permission. Permission to stand tall, permission to take control, permission to carve out a future, not defined by the mistakes of those who came before her, but by the lessons Lois had imparted." The silence that followed felt like the beginning of something new, something unspoken but understood. Maya knew Lois had left her everything she needed. And now, she would carry her grandmother's legacy forward, with purpose and clarity, as Lois had always intended. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring at the paperwork in front of him. His hands, once sure and steady when they were used to signing Lois's checks and papers, now trembled as he signed the refinancing documents. The house, what had once been their grand prize, a symbol of their entitlement, was no longer theirs in the same way. It had shrunk, like everything else. With no cosigner, no leverage, no claim to Lois's fortune, they were left with a modest home. One that had been remade by someone who wasn't interested in anything but the appearance of things. The once spacious, picture-perfect house now felt small. The walls, once filled with the illusion of wealth, felt like they were closing in on him. There would be no more lavish dinners, no more parties designed to show off what they had earned, because what they had was taken, not earned. And it wasn't just the house. Their photos were removed from the nonprofit's donor wall. The plaques that once bore their names, carefully designed to make them seem like integral players in Lois's legacy, were stripped away. The simple truth hung like an invisible weight in the air. They had never belonged there. It wasn't the money they'd donated. It was the reputation they'd bought with their proximity to Lois. And now, without it, they had nothing. There would be no seats at the gala either. No invitations to speak about their contributions. They had been erased, their names wiped from the foundation they had never truly belonged to. Lois's will had been the final act of justice. A small, almost imperceptible adjustment in the grand scheme of things, but one that stripped them of the last vestige of illusion they had held onto. Maya, on the other hand, moved forward. She stepped into the role Lois had prepared her for, even if Lois had never said a word about it. Maya was the one who picked up the pieces, who turned the archival project into a living, breathing testimony of Lois's life. Each file, each design Lois had created, was scanned with the care and reverence it deserved. Maya worked with precision, her hands steady as she cataloged every detail, every decision Lois had made in her quiet, calculated way. It was a quiet kind of power, one that didn't need a stage or applause, and it was exactly what Maya needed. She wasn't going to wait for anyone to recognize her. She was going to make sure Lois's legacy lived on, not as a shadow, but as something that stood firm, something that was as real as the work Lois had put into her life. Weeks passed, and Maya began to find herself in the public eye. A local interview turned into a national feature. The focus shifted from the family's feigned grief to the work Lois had done, to the real meaning of her legacy. When asked about her inheritance, Maya responded with unflinching honesty. She left them nothing? No. She left them a mirror. The words struck a chord. Lois hadn't just taken the money from them. She had taken away the veil they had been hiding behind, and in its place, there was only a reflection of who they truly were. For a moment, the silence that followed in the interview room was deafening. The reporter, who had expected a story about a granddaughter mourning a loss, now found himself confronting the brutal reality that the legacy he'd come to cover wasn't a fairy tale. It was something darker. It was a lesson in consequences. Meanwhile, Heather, still trying to salvage what was left of her self-image, launched a coaching brand. She promoted herself as a life strategist, an expert in guiding others to find success in their lives. She used the same smile she had perfected in front of cameras, the one that had once convinced everyone she was the caring daughter-in-law, the one who had played the part so well. But it wasn't enough. In 6 weeks, the brand collapsed. The followers vanished. The promises of transformation faded away. Heather's expertise, like her apology, had no foundation. She had spent so long pretending to be someone she wasn't that there was nothing left to hold onto when the facade crumbled. The failure was public. The comments on her posts, once glowing with admiration, became cruel. The silence grew, and Heather's once esteemed social media accounts became empty echoes of the life she had constructed, her false claims collapsing under their own weight. It wasn't the world that had failed her. It was her own lies. Ethan, too, faded into the background. He avoided the public eye, the press, the invitations. He had nothing left to offer. No false charity, no family legacy. He existed in the space between the world that had seen him as something of value and the one that had finally seen through him. As their lives shrank to the size they truly deserved, Maya moved forward. She wasn't concerned with their collapse. Their failures had been written long ago. Her focus was on the future, on carrying Lois's legacy in a way that mattered. The nonprofit, the projects, the work Lois had built. Maya would make sure they continued, strong and true, long after the Markham name had faded from their grasp. Lois's life had been one of quiet defiance, of standing alone when everyone else was chasing shadows. Maya understood that now, and as she sat in the dim light of her office, going through another set of Lois's files, she realized something crucial. Lois had never needed the world to recognize her. She had made sure of that. And in the end, the world would remember Lois for exactly what she had given. Not wealth, not status, but the truth. And Maya? She would carry it forward, one quiet step at a time. The gala was bathed in soft, golden light, the air thick with the hum of conversation. People moved in clusters, clusters of the rich, the influential, and the ones who saw themselves as part of the story Lois had written with her life. The Markham Center for Elder Justice was finally getting the recognition it deserved, a national model for protecting the elderly from exploitation, a mission Lois had dreamed of and Maya was now carrying forward. But none of them knew what was coming. Not yet. In the back, behind the velvet curtains and the carefully arranged centerpieces, a flash drive sat in an envelope. It was delivered by an anonymous courier, handed off without a word, without an explanation. Just the envelope. The drive inside it held something precious, something Lois had left for one last message, one last statement. The lights dimmed. The room quieted, the murmurs slowly dying down as the projector whirred to life. On the large screen, a single image appeared. Lois Markham, calm, confident, and unblinking, her eyes as sharp as they had ever been. She stared straight into the camera, as though she were looking directly at the crowd that had once shunned her, at the family that had abandoned her. The video started with the faint sound of Lois's voice. "If they say they loved me, ask when." Lois's voice rang out, unyielding, a statement that carried more weight than any apology could. "If they say they helped, ask how." Maya's heart clenched in her chest as she watched, knowing the crowd had no idea what was coming next. She sat in the back of the room, her hand resting on a shawl that still carried the faint scent of cedar from Lois's favorite chair. The camera focused on Lois's face as she spoke, but Maya's eyes were fixed on the screen. There was no need for her to be seen, she had no need to be applauded. The truth was now unspoken, living in the flickering images before them. The words, sharp and deliberate, filled the room like an echo of a life fully lived and fully understood. Lois had never needed recognition. She had never needed the world to see her in the light they now wanted to cast her. She had built her own legacy, a legacy that could not be touched by their fleeting claims of affection or remorse. The screen began to fade to black, and in that moment, as the final words lingered in the air, the crowd rose. They were caught off guard, but it wasn't surprise. It was the quiet realization that something larger was at play here. They rose, not out of respect for a widow's sorrow, not out of some misplaced attempt to make up for what had been lost, but out of a recognition of the truth. Lois Markham had left her mark, not just on the world, but on the very people who thought they could take everything from her. When the screen went completely dark, a soft rustling filled the air. A plaque was unveiled under a gleaming bronze tree sculpture, a sculpture Lois had designed herself, one that would forever stand in the heart of the Markham Center. The plaque read, "She gave." Then she stopped. And in stopping, she reclaimed everything. Maya couldn't help the faint smile that tugged at the corners of her lips. Her grandmother had done more than just live. She had reclaimed herself, piece by piece, from the people who had tried to take what wasn't theirs. The camera zoomed in on Maya as she stood. The words on the plaque seemed to hang in the air around her, as if they were meant for her, and her alone. She had done it. She had carried Lois's legacy forward, and now, the world would remember Lois not as a victim, but as a woman who chose the moment she would speak, and the moment she would stop. In the following weeks, the Markham Center would become a beacon for elder justice. The work Lois had started, the battles she had fought, were now being continued with unwavering strength, a new generation at the helm. And the name Markham? It would no longer be tied to the family that tried to exploit it. It would now carry the weight of everything Lois had given, her integrity, her resilience, her refusal to be erased. And when the world tried to take her memory and twist it, to rewrite the story of who she was, Maya knew they would fail. Lois had already written her story in the most permanent way possible. "After the accident, they thought I'd never return," Lois's voice echoed in Maya's mind as the memory of the gala lingered. "So I let the deed speak louder than anything they ever said." Maya watched the bronze tree, the light glinting off its polished surface. It felt as if, in that moment, the world had shifted. Lois Markham was gone, but she had left behind something irrefutable, something that would carry forward long after the last word was spoken. The world may have thought Lois's absence was the end of her story, but Maya knew better. This was only the beginning.